Welcome to today's activity. The idea is to discuss the topic of death, but from an approach that is not so much focused on the phenomenon of death itself, although we can also talk about that if it is of interest to you. Rather, we will explore why remembering death has always been so important in so many civilizations. Why has the remembrance of death not always been so terrifying? In fact, sometimes it wasn't at all terrifying in many civilizations of the past, the way it is for us today, in many cases. There is a phrase, a Latin expression called memento mori. This Latin phrase, memento mori, literally means, remember that you are going to die. Can you imagine how many places this inscription was engraved in? Memento mori. In people's homes, in places where people pass through, in commercial institutions, including in the city as a whole. Memento mori. Why was it so important for them to remember this? What were they going to die of? Was there some kind of morbidity there? Were they masochists? Why this need to constantly remember death? There was, in fact, a very prominent and important Roman, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who said exactly this. In other words, that one should take death as a counselor. It is an excellent counselor. Let us try to understand the perspective of these people who remembered death not precisely because of death itself, but because of life. They believed that remembering that one will die gave a person a completely different possibility of living. There is a theory, not of Latin origin, but one that also influences the Roman world and civilizations in general, called the theory of impact. What exactly is the theory of impact? It simply states the following, that consciousness is born from contrast. Imagine, for example, a very common situation. We often only value something we've had our whole lives once we lose it. Or sometimes we appreciate a city we lived in only on the day we move away from it. Or we value a person who was always with us only when we lose them. Contrast. Imagine the following, the contrast between two colors, in this case, gray and blue. Why do I know that gray and blue exist? Because here is where one ends and the other begins. It is in the contrast between two planes that consciousness arises. This is a very ancient theory. Imagine if the entire universe were completely gray. We would have no awareness of gray. Pythagoras used to say that a musical note sounded throughout the universe at all times, which was the music of the spheres. Do you hear the music of the spheres? We do not hear it. Why? According to him, because it never ceased. So, the contrast between sound and silence was never produced. Therefore, there is no consciousness. Thus, when we have the contrast between two planes, we perceive the difference between them and learn to value and properly assess each one. So, when would we be in the best position to evaluate the value of life? In the face of death. In the contrast between death and life, we find a touchstone to perceive the true value of life, to establish a hierarchy of what is truly important. Some of you were here recently. We held a course about 3 weeks ago on time management, and for those who attended, I spoke precisely about this topic. When I tell you, plan your day or your week, most of the time, you only think about what you are going to do or what you intend to have. Isn't that right? This week I will pay these bills, go to these places, I will do these tasks. It is rare for you to plan who you want to be in the short term. Well, I will strive to overcome this mental pattern of criticism, this tendency, this friction in relationships. We do not plan, we do not think about who we want to be in the short term. But when you look at the long term, at your life as a whole, what we think about most, what becomes most important, is who we are. Well, who will I be in the end? What will I have built within myself? At that moment, having and doing become absolutely unnecessary, of little importance. Do you see this? It is very difficult to imagine someone, when facing death, stopping to tally up their resources, or their properties, or the bills that are about to come due. In that moment, having and doing lose their value, and being reigns supreme. Therefore, here you can already see that this tradition has its reason. When we think on a grand scale of time, when we place ourselves face to face with death, we gain a perception of what is truly valuable in life. This would give us the opportunity, by bringing this perception into the present moment, to properly prioritize our lives. Many other thinkers throughout history have also spoken about this. I always mention a study by a doctor from very recently, a few years ago, an American physician, psychiatrist, and thanatologist who spent her entire life caring for terminally ill patients. And she spoke about something very similar to this. She said the following: "Look, the more materialistic my patients were, the less often they arrived lucid at the moment of death." I find her observation very interesting. She said, "Look, in the face of death, it becomes clear to a person what is real and what is not. And if they have spent their entire life on things that, at that moment, they realize have no substance, the consciousness cannot bear this fact and withdraws. So, they entered a process of mental alienation, coma, or memory loss, as a way for the consciousness to avoid confronting the fact that it did not recognize many real things in the life that was left behind. Because when faced with such a realization, in the presence of death, only what we are matters, only what we have built within ourselves and in those around us, in the realm of being. Having becomes very secondary. It is valid only as a means, never as an end. This becomes evident to anyone when faced with such a contrast. So it becomes clear that life is a resource which can be well or poorly used. It can be well or poorly managed. You notice something curious, and it is interesting for us to reflect on this. Given the same amount of resources, one person creates wonders while another does nothing. Isn't that so? There is even a biblical parable of the talents that speaks about this. 3 men received the same amount of talents, which is a type of currency. A talent is placed in the hands of one man and it multiplies. In the hands of another, it is lost. In the hands of the third, it is simply kept and preserved. Thus, a resource such as life can be infinitely extended, or it can be tremendously brief and limited. In an era where we focus heavily on quantitative measures, we tend to believe that someone who lives a long life necessarily has more opportunities than someone whose life is short. Notice and look back, you will see that the great figures of history, at times, had very few years of life in quantitative terms. Alexander the Great, or a poet I greatly admire, Khalil Gibran, died at the age of 42. Many lived very short lives. Can you say that these individuals had little life, or did they experience an incredibly intense life within just a few years? So, all these elements come to the surface when we reflect on the idea of death. The theory of impact brings us precisely this idea. Recently, perhaps some of you have seen, by the way, it is closely related to the theme of this talk. Last week, the magazine Super Interessant was released at newsstands, and on the cover was the photo of a boy. As you turn the pages, the back cover, inside, outside. There was a Photoshop production where they gradually aged him, and it ended with him as an elder. And the article was about the eternity of the physical body. Well, I won't delve too much into the content of that article right now. We might even address it later on, but one of the points I found very curious and quite bizarre in that article was the following. It stated that, according to our current technological developments, perhaps 100 years from now, humanity could have a lifespan of 200 years, and that this would allow all people to become very wise. I found that very curious, quite amusing. Just imagine deducing that a person will become wise simply because they have lived for 200 years. So, let's be honest, we would have to consider many figures celebrated throughout history as very ignorant. Take, for example, Jesus Christ, who only lived to be 33. Let's be honest. So, this mentality that life is valued by its quantity rather than its quality becomes very clear when you contrast it with death. How much life do we actually put into this time we have? That is why they regarded death as a counselor, a very precious counselor, indeed, so that they could learn how to truly live. Our intention here today is to work more deeply with this idea, how death, or the very notion of death, gives us a clear perspective that helps us to live. One of the challenges we face nowadays is that everything is considered relative. Have you ever stopped to notice that? Has it ever happened that you tried, with good intentions, to advise someone that their behavior was no longer appropriate, and they responded by saying, "What is good for you is not good for me"? The fact that you don't agree with what I am doing doesn't mean anything. And this is something we experience a lot nowadays. Everything is relative to such an extent that many today consider values themselves to be relative. Justice, kindness, fraternity, everything is seen as relative. So what is just for you is not just for me. Who are you to judge me? As if there were no absolutes in nature. This is a curious thing because it makes life almost unworkable. Have you ever imagined if you were to approach a corrupt person and say to them, "Look, what you are doing is not just"? They might reply, "Well, for me it is. It's a relative matter. What is good for you is not good for me." Well, how can we manage social life under these terms? We are drowning in, let's say, a kind of human immaturity, believing that everything is relative and failing to recognize that there are certain absolute things. Well, in this sense, life and death are two very important markers, because there is no way to question either of them. Whether you believe in them or not, they are there, and they show humanity that there are certain things, I even believe that many things, if not all, that do not depend on our opinion and that exist regardless. Whether one believes in it or not, it compels us to take a mature stance in the face of these markers, rather than playing hide-and-seek with life, endlessly believing that we can create justice or create goodness, for that is a realm of relativities where nothing truly real exists. Well, life and death are present before us. They are concrete markers, and they compel us to take a stand and reflect on what we desire from both, what we want from our life, and who we wish to be when it comes to an end. One of the most basic and fundamental truths that common sense teaches us is that we can only build something meaningful if each day of our lives is dedicated to carrying a brick for that construction. And if we do not reflect on what we wish to build, we will likely end up building nothing at all. Therefore, if we want, at the end of our lives, to have built for ourselves a life that is meaningful, that brings us certain serenity, that grants us that awareness, as the famous Mexican poet Amado Nervo once said, "Life, you owe me nothing. Life, we are at peace." If you wish to be able to say this to your own life, it is essential that you know clearly what you want from it, and that you manage this resource wisely, starting from now. Thus, this topic of relativity could keep us talking all night, because it is an issue we face today. Humans believe that what they think is what the world is. It's as if you imagine, in the Middle Ages, everyone believed the Earth was flat. Did the Earth stop being a geoid because of that? There are things that exist, even if humanity did not, and they exist in and of themselves, not because we believe in them or cease to believe in them. And one of the things our society does is to pretend not to talk about death, as if by not speaking or thinking about it, death would cease to exist. In other words, we believe we have all this power over nature, but things are not quite like that. Well, I have selected 3 thinkers for you, Parmenides, Plato, and the third, who is not exactly a thinker, but rather a classic work, the Bardo Thodol, which is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I won't delve too deeply into the Tibetan Book of the Dead here, because it could be the subject of an entire lecture on its own, but let's draw some interesting ideas from these two thinkers and this classic book about death within the approach I want to share with you. The main focus of this lecture is more about teaching how to live than actually discussing the phenomenon of death itself. Parmenides, as recounted in the doxography about his life, often stated that many things in which humans believe do not truly exist, among them death. And you know that philosophers have often been misunderstood throughout history, and this remains true even today. And in the face of the clear evidence that many people died, Parmenides denied the existence of death. This led people in Elia, the city where he lived, to consider that perhaps he was not entirely sound in his ideas, as such a claim seemed madness. I mentioned that on one occasion, an important figure had died in the city of Elia, and when Parmenides passed by, the story goes that he saw that gathering of people and asked, "But what is happening over there?" "What do you mean? You don't know." Parmenides. "So and so has died." "Ah, but haven't I already told you death does not exist?" "We knew he wasn't right in the head." "How can death not exist?" Parmenides. "Look, the man is completely dead." He replied, "Well, let us question, then, so that we may reach a conclusion about whether death exists or not, and about what it is that lives. And then, based on these elements of life, you will tell me what it is that dies." Then, after hours of debate with that group of young investigators trying to discover what living things are made of, they reached the following conclusion, that all living things are composed of spirit, matter, and form. I don't know if you realize that matter as substance is different from form as idea. So if I say plastic to you, you don't know what I'm talking about. If I say pitcher, I have plastic plus the form of a pitcher. These are two different things. And so they concluded that everything that exists is an amalgam, a mixture of these three elements, spirit, matter, and form. He made sure that everyone had understood this conclusion, that they had all reached the same point, and then he moved on to the next argument. "Well, that's right. So tell me, among these three things, which one dies?" "Does spirit die?" "Well, spirit is not a sensory perception. We cannot give a definitive answer to that, but if it exists, it does not die, because a mortal spirit is not spirit. By definition, if it exists, it is immortal. Does matter die?" What do you think? Does it die? Our friend Lavoisier, who, as they say, lost his head over this, used to say that in nature nothing is lost, nothing is created, everything is transformed. So imagine a handful of matter, a handful of substance. You can disintegrate it down to its atomic particles. Where will all of this be? Right here. And it will go on to form another body, right? Matter is also eternal. It is immortal. And what about form? Does it die? Does it die or not? Do me a favor, kill the triangle. Just this small favor. Kill it. Can you? Well, you told me that it's possible to kill form. What are you going to do? Are you going to go around destroying triangles like crazy? It will return to the realm of ideas. Soon, it will incarnate in another handful of substance. You destroy it, and it returns to the realm of ideas. Forms are ideas. How can you kill an idea? Killing triangles is an utterly hopeless career. You will not succeed. Because what are ideas as well? Eternal. Now, notice the situation Parmenides has placed these young people in. Because spirit is eternal, matter is eternal, form is eternal, and human beings are made of these three things, and none of the three die, yet there lies the man, dead. How can this be explained? And then, faced with the confusion that arose, he said, "Calm down, let's take it slowly. Let me explain to you what is happening here. What happens is that there is something that a human being truly is. And there is something else, which is what he is only temporarily, as if it were a garment. And this garment is composed of matter and form. It is a union of a handful of substance with a certain form, which is the form you have today. But this union, our consciousness looks at it and says, I am this. And it identifies itself with this. But it is a union highly susceptible to divorce. At a certain moment, that handful of substance departs, and that idea returns to the realm of ideas. And the consciousness that was identified with this combination, what does it say? I died. Where am I? I died. If it identified with what you truly are, and not with what you temporarily are, it would not experience this phenomenon of death. In other words, in truth, death is the identification of consciousness with a transient and not definitive state. I do not know if Parmenides convinced those young people with this, but I find the explanation quite sensible. And Plato would go even further with this idea. He said the following, among many things he spoke about on this subject. He said, if what you truly are is immortal, and all your tradition speaks of this, all your work speaks of this, what you are is immortal, and death comes precisely from the identification with a fleeting phenomenon, which is what you temporarily are. As you identify with that which is mortal, when this, at a certain moment, decomposes, because this union is mortal, when this union dissolves, you fall into a state of unconsciousness, because you are identified with what you are not. Therefore, death is synonymous with unconsciousness. Do you understand this idea? Death is a state of unconsciousness into which you fall by identifying with what you are not. Now, if death is unconsciousness and there exists within humanity a desire that echoes throughout history to overcome death, this desire is, in fact, to overcome unconsciousness. It is the same thing, a basic exercise in logic. And what did he say? It is not fair for a person to seek to overcome unconsciousness after life if they have not first overcome it within life itself. So, if you consider that death is equivalent to unconsciousness, and you look at the entirety of an ordinary person's life, are they more dead or more alive? For most of their life, are they more conscious or more unconscious? Pause for a moment to reflect, to try to synthesize. We are at a moment of synthesis, the beginning of a new year. Try to synthesize everything that happened in your life over the past year, all of us here. And let us notice how few events we actually remember. We remember only what we lived through with awareness. Most things are lost in a black hole of distraction, inattention, and unconsciousness. Is this not a kind of death? It is. So he would say, for someone to hope to overcome unconsciousness after life, they must first overcome it within life itself. Do you understand this? Otherwise, there is no merit in claiming something like this. One is fighting against something at a time when they have not yet overcome it in the present moment. Right? They would not be in a position to demand so much from life. So, these are some interesting considerations for us to realize how these philosophers reflected on the phenomenon of death, and how this helped them to enrich their own lives and the life of humanity. Well, another interesting point to notice is the perspective offered by the Bardo Thodol. As I mentioned to you, the Bardo Thodol is entirely about death. For those who are not familiar with the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it is a book that, up until the time when China invaded Tibet, was still in use. Today, I am not sure how things are there, as it is difficult to know the current situation in Tibet. But this book used to be read by an officiant into the ear of a dying person from the moment they began to agonize, and then, at a set time, it was read every day after death for 49 days. It served as guidance for the disembodied consciousness, and within it, there is a whole set of information about death that is difficult to find elsewhere. But I will not delve into the Bardo Thodol regarding the phenomenon of death right now. I just want to highlight for you a phrase that I find very powerful in the Bardo Thodol, one of those phrases meant to shake the human consciousness. They say the following: the ideal in life would be for a person to retain from each event what it taught them in depth and to forget the price they paid for it. Do you understand? If, for every event in your life, you remembered what it taught you and forgot how hard the price was. Since people do not do this, they end up accumulating a burden of bitterness, of negative memories, of heavy things upon their shoulders. They say, when this burden becomes so heavy that it is no longer possible for a person to take even a single step toward their growth, toward their self-improvement, that person has decided it is time to die. When you have accumulated such a heavy load of negative memories, of bitterness, of unpleasant things, to the point that it prevents you from taking a step toward growth as a human being, you have decided it is time to die, because there is no life when there is no longer an opportunity to learn. Do you see this? So, if we look at this wise Tibetan advice, we will realize that, in general, we do the opposite. Or we hold on to both things, which, in a way, even has a certain merit. I learned from that experience, but I still remember how much it hurt. Or sometimes we do even worse. We hold on only to how much it hurt and learn nothing from the experience. Doesn't that happen? It is very common. It's as if you imagine you are trying to buy some merchandise and you start that healthy negotiation with the shopkeeper, because that's where the purchase really begins, isn't it? No, it's too expensive, it's too cheap, and he won't lower the price, and you get irritated, and he argues back. After much arguing, you agree to pay what he asks. And you leave grumbling because the price was high, and you leave the merchandise on the counter. Don't we do the same thing? We suffer, and suffer from the events of life, and we go on grumbling through life. And what did this event teach you? What did it allow you to grow from? What was it? You know, I never thought about that. You paid the price, but didn't take the merchandise. Notice how curious this is, and we do it constantly. This creates a ball chained to our foot, growing heavier and heavier, until a certain point comes when it no longer allows us to move forward. Then, according to Bardo, what does life say? Time to die. Let me do you a favor. Let me cut off this iron ball that's chained to your foot. Notice how curious this is, because according to this tradition, death is a merciful cloak, for it frees you from the burden, makes you light again so you can return to growth, because that is what it's about, according to this tradition. There is no life where there is no opportunity for improvement, for growth toward what nature expects of us as human beings. And here is another element I would like to discuss with you, which is also very interesting, this question of the journey. Bardo says, when our journey becomes impossible, it is time to die. What journey is this? So, does life have a purpose? Does it bear fruit? Do we have somewhere to arrive? Is it not chaos, where we go in any direction? According to all traditions that speak of life and death, life is a journey for humanity, a journey toward the attainment of the human condition. Nature expects each being to become that for which it was created. So, it expects plants to be plants. It expects animals to be animals. It expects humans to be human, to fulfill that which corresponds to them within the order of nature. So, it expects plants to perform photosynthesis. It expects animals to follow their instincts, to reproduce, to perpetuate themselves. It expects humans to possess values, virtues, and wisdom. Just yesterday, I was speaking with the young people who were here about this very topic. Imagine if each of these beings did not fulfill its function. If the plant stops performing photosynthesis, it renders the entire food chain unviable, and organic life on the planet comes to an end. Isn't that so? If animals stop feeding themselves or stop reproducing, that species becomes extinct, and this will create an imbalance throughout the planet's biological equilibrium, in the entire structure of life on Earth, in the planet's ecosystem. And if human beings stop nourishing themselves with values, what happens then? He does not only destroy organic life, nor just the ecosystem. He can even destroy the planet itself, because he becomes an animal endowed with a mind, which is something extremely dangerous, since with the same instinctive objectives, but now amplified by a thinking mind. Do you realize the danger this represents? Imagine a wild beast whose only objectives are the instincts of survival and reproduction. If you give this beast a mind, and it is now able to maximize its ability to fulfill these instincts, because the mind is an incredibly powerful tool, it becomes a predator that nothing can restrain. Therefore, to handle a tool as delicate as the mind, it is necessary that a human truly be human, guided by values, by virtues, by wisdom. And when this is not done, he undermines himself even more than if there were no plants or no animals at all. Recognize the risk that lies in this. Thus, all of nature awaits for humanity to truly be human, to attain the attributes of a human being, the values that define us. According to these traditions, there is a purpose to life that is not arbitrary, not simply what each person thinks or desires. We are here to become human. When nature needs a plant, it declares, "Present, I am here." When nature needs an animal, it responds, "Present." Nature also needs human beings, and we have come here to truly realize that which we hold in potential. This is one of the fundamental elements for us to live, to understand what it means to live as a human being, and not just to live in any manner, because that is not truly living, that is merely surviving. All men die, but not all men truly live. Some merely survive. Well, there is another interesting element, which these ancient traditions also speak of. We are making a comparative study here, drawing parallels among several of them. They used to say the following: "Nothing that is truly yours can ever be taken from you. Nothing that truly belongs to you can be taken away from you. Not even death can take from you that which truly belongs to you." Let us begin with the hypothesis that this is true. What is it that death cannot take from us? All your material possessions? It can. All your bonds with the people around you? It can. This here, can it take it away? It can. It can, and it will, at a certain moment. What is it that death cannot take from us? That which we are. If you are just, if you are a person of integrity, if you are someone who has attained a certain level of values, virtues, and wisdom, according to these traditions, not even death can take that from you. So that is truly yours. Therefore, when we do not focus our lives on attaining the things that truly belong to us, we leave this life empty-handed. So, this phrase is also very useful because it shows us what can, in fact, be attained by us, what is valid, what is true, what survives the test of the theory of impact, what is truly ours. Well, but let us approach the situation from another perspective. Let us imagine that we are faced with an extremely materialistic person who says to me, "Look, I don't believe in that." "Ah, no, that's just empty talk. How can death not take everything away? Death is extinction. It takes everything. Nothing remains. I don't believe in that." Well, even in this case, I could turn to a phrase from the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, which I find very interesting. It's not exactly a phrase, but rather a situation that is said to have happened to him where the materialists of his time, because there have always been materialists, though I don't know if there always will be, and I hope not, but there have always been throughout history, came to him and said, "Emperor, you are a man who strives so much for virtue, who works so hard for integrity, for justice. Have you ever considered the possibility that there might be nothing after death, and that all your effort might not be worthwhile?" Well, you know that Marcus Aurelius belonged to the Stoic school, and the Stoics are great logicians. They work extensively with logic, and he employs a very simple and highly effective logical exercise. Look, my friend, there are only two possibilities. The first is this: let's suppose there is something after death. In that case, It is worthwhile to have values now, because afterwards you will certainly be able to keep them and continue perpetuating yourself by living these values. Therefore, it is valid. The second is that there is nothing after death. In that case, it is still worthwhile to have values now, because this is the only opportunity you have to possess them. Do you understand this? If there is nothing after death, that is all the more reason for you to live as a human being, because you will not have another chance, so make the most of it. So, in any case, values are the best thing a person can have, because that is what we are here for. Now, see how interesting this is. One of the challenges today is convincing people that having values is something good for them, something that brings them joy. Do you remember what I mentioned earlier about the stone, the animal, and the human being? What nourishes a plant, for example, is water and sunlight. And if you offer it water, it absorbs that water with complete satisfaction, because it knows this gives it life as a plant. What nourishes an animal is its food, and when you offer it, the animal eagerly comes toward you to get the food, because it knows that this keeps it alive and able to fulfill its purpose. But when it comes to what nourishes a human being, values, if you offer them, the person often refuses. You have to give them some kind of reward for embracing values, or threaten them with some punishment if they do not. Isn't that curious? In other words, it is a being that needs to be subordinated in order to be nourished. It's something strange, as if you had to go to a plant and say, "Look, if you drink water, I'll give you this much. But if you don't drink, I'll punish you." How strange that is, because a person should have a thirst for values, just as a plant has for water. No, we live in a society where it's complicated to understand an ethical person. Our ethics stem from coercion. People act ethically because if they don't, they will be punished. And if they do, they will be rewarded. And it becomes headline news when someone is more ethical than average, right? It takes an entire social pressure and a host of rewards for a person to be ethical, that is, for them to nourish themselves. Isn't that curious? In other words, it seems as if human beings do not know the taste of being human, have not refined their palate, do not know the flavor of human life, and therefore need to be forced to do what is expected of them within the order of nature. This is truly curious. And so, we begin to discuss the concept of happiness. To have values is worthwhile in itself, not because of what you might gain or lose from it. And this is an element that leads us into another sphere, which is the realm of ethics and morality. Is it possible that a person is only truly ethical if they are ethical because they love to be so? And not because they will gain or lose something from it, not for reward or punishment, but for the immense satisfaction of nourishing themselves with what is truly their own. It is an almost grace-like state to be nourished by what is inherent to oneself, by being human. This must be something of utmost importance to them, something of exceptional value. According to these traditions, this would be human happiness. Being just should not be motivated by the reward you might receive afterward, but by justice itself. As Marcus Aurelius said, there is nothing more wonderful than the opportunity to be just, right, Rana? There is even a very beautiful poem by a philosopher from that school in which he says exactly this: the greatest reward for one who loves is precisely to be loving. The greatest reward for one who is just is precisely to be just, and not what may come afterward, whether as a reward or as punishment. Human happiness would consist in being human and fulfilling oneself in that, right? Kant had a phrase that I find very interesting. Kant is a thinker whom people sometimes do not enjoy reading very much because he is somewhat complex in the way he expresses himself, but he has many beautiful ideas, and this one in particular about human happiness I find very beautiful. He says the following: in general, when a person seeks happiness, human happiness, as an end, it is not true human happiness that he finds. When he seeks values as an end, as a byproduct, he finds human happiness. If he seeks happiness obsessively, he will want it at any cost, and ends up experiencing an animalistic kind of happiness. If he seeks values, as a result he will attain the happiness that truly corresponds to him. This happiness comes precisely from being, and not from having or losing. Now imagine how interesting this is, because this is the great beauty of human life. We are speaking of death, and we are also speaking of life, the insights that death gives us about life. Because a plant has no way to choose whether or not to be happy. A plant cannot choose whether or not to perform photosynthesis. An animal cannot choose whether or not to act on instinct, but a human being can choose whether or not to be virtuous. And by choosing to do so, he earns the merit of having conquered his own nature. It was not given freely, it is an achievement. The conquest of human nature would be the greatest of all achievements. And yet, we often trade away our human nature for anything at all. Imagine, plants and animals do not have this free will, this choice. They are beings under tutelage. We have this choice. We can choose to be human or not, right? And by being so, we fulfill our nature. We advance along the path that is truly ours, don't we? So, it is very important that we are able to understand this idea of happiness. The happiness that truly belongs to us as human beings is the one that fulfills us as humans by doing what is expected of us here on earth. There is a tale, an ancient story. I really enjoy telling stories because you might notice that after some time, you may not remember many of the arguments I present, but perhaps some of these little stories will stay with you, right? And this is a well-known story, one that is part of countless tales and narratives connected to the Zen tradition. It is said that there were two young men, two monks, washing clothes by a river. And one of them noticed that a scorpion was heading toward the water and began to drown. So he went over and saved the scorpion, and the scorpion stung him. Then he continued washing his clothes. Soon after, the same scorpion, and the other young man observing the situation. The same scorpion heads toward the water again, begins to drown once more, and the young man goes over, sees it again, and saves it again, and once again, the scorpion stings him. At this point, the second young man can no longer resist his curiosity in such a strange event. He asks, "Why are you doing this? This ungrateful scorpion stings you as you save life. Why do you keep doing this?" He replies, "Look, what I don't understand is why you're asking me this question, because each of us is simply doing what is in our nature. He is a scorpion, he stings. I am a human being, I have compassion. This is part of the order of nature. Wouldn't it be strange if scorpions felt compassion and humans stung? Everything that is proper to humanity, as Marcus Aurelius once said, should bring us fulfillment, should bring us happiness. This is a way to find glory in the fact that we are human and to give life its true meaning, all right? And to ensure that death finds us at peace, as Amado Nervo once said, "Life, you owe me nothing. Life, we are at peace." Another interesting point that I wanted to share with you is about certain traditions. I brought here the Inca perspective, a people whose history I deeply admire. They are a pre-Columbian civilization, our neighbors, about whom we know so little, the Incas. They are not the only ones, but I will use them as an example, because I find their story very beautiful, and it will help you understand this idea. Many times throughout history, there have been civilizations that believed that without this human nature, life is not worth living. There are certain things, look, if you have to pay the price of your dignity, of your human nature, just to survive, sometimes that price is too high, and it may not be worth paying. It can be an ungrateful exchange. This may seem strange to our civilization, which believes that physical survival should prevail above all else. This is to show you the value that was given to life by these traditions, and to help you understand that there have been civilizations that believe that either one lives as a human being, or it is better not to live at all. They placed a value on this human condition far above what we give it today, perhaps because we do not even understand it. We live in a peculiar society, one that explains to us what machines are, what the stars are, but does not explain what human beings are. We do not know who we are or what we have come here to do. This story, which is a very interesting one, and some of you may already know it because you enjoy telling it, recounts that the Incas were already on the verge of being defeated by the Spanish. Pizarro arrives in pre-Columbian America and begins making deals with indigenous tribes, gradually undermining the great Inca Empire that existed at the time. And it is said that one of the factors behind Pizarro's success, because, for those who do not know, he arrived in pre-Columbian America with only 600 men, was, first, the alliances he forged through acts of corruption with the indigenous tribes themselves. But secondly, without a doubt, it was the way they waged war. For pre-Columbian civilizations, although this may seem strange to us today, war was ceremonial. And the ethics of war were fundamental. To lose their ethics, they would rather lose the war. On the other side of the ocean and in another era, another figure, Julius Caesar, also spoke of this, saying, "I would rather lose the war than lose the spirit of Rome, because otherwise I no longer know what I am fighting for." And these people, in particular the Incas, had several interesting customs. One of the stories told, which is quite beautiful, is that when their armies faced each other in broad daylight, always with the mummy of their ancestral founder at the front, they would say a prayer. And they would ask that the arm of the gods, especially that of Inti, their son-father, would stand not by their side, but by the side of the just, whoever that might be. Can you imagine the weight of such a request? May the arm of Father Inti stand by the side of the just, whoever that may be. Well, and all this code of war ethics that the Incas upheld, when faced with a Spanish invader who did not observe any kind of war ethics, led to their defeat, among many other factors. It was not the only reason, but it was one of the elements that contributed to their downfall. The Spanish, for example, would launch attacks from the rear at night, catching the armies while they slept. They would destroy supplies to starve them, and they committed what the Incas considered the most abominable act of all. When the armies withdrew from the cities, the Spanish would attack the cities left with only women and children in order to break the spirit of the warriors. They employed every kind of tactic you can imagine, all of which were anything but ethical. And with this, the Incas were gradually defeated. It is said that, in the final days, they retreated to a stronghold in the city of Vitcos, in the mountains of Vilcabamba. The last Incas waged a kind of guerrilla warfare against Pizarro, who was already in Cusco and had taken control of the city. And Pizarro, along with his successors over the following years, kept trying to bribe and corrupt these Inca leaders in order to bring an end to the conflict. One of them, whose name you may recognize from a very unfortunate episode, he became a symbol of guerrilla resistance, Tupac Amaru, who must still be turning in his grave because of it, was approached by a Spanish ambassador sent to speak with him and ask under what conditions he would accept surrender. And he refused any agreement of surrender. And as this Spanish diplomat, this negotiator, was already leaving, he decided to turn back. "Look, since I am here, let me ask you a question. I have been observing this whole process of the war, and I noticed that one of the factors that led you to the defeat you suffered was the way you fought. Now, look, the first time you saw the way we fought, it must have been a great surprise to you. The second time, a surprise. The 10th time, still a surprise. But by the 20th, 30th, 40th time you saw it, it was no longer a surprise. Why didn't you imitate us? Why didn't you use our own tactics against us? Why did you allow yourselves to be defeated in this way?" It is said that Tupac Amaru, very calmly, stood up, turned to this emissary and said the following: "Look, there is something you may not understand about us, the Incas. We, the Incas, only want the land if it is to stand upright upon it. If it is to crawl upon the earth, we would rather leave that to you. And so they did. And so they did. So, this is a story that I really like and find very interesting, very powerful, isn't it? It shows that life has not always been viewed through the same lens we use today. There was a time when values were greater than life itself. Notice how things are lost over the course of history, lost in the memory of humankind, because as heritage, it is still there. And it was believed that human happiness consisted in the discovery of this treasure, which was the set of values that ensured not just any kind of life, but a truly human life, one that would allow a person to face death peacefully, serenely, without debts, without regrets, without bitterness. This was always the secret of these traditional civilizations. Well, and now, I know that some of you may have come here out of curiosity, wondering, but what did various traditions throughout history think about the technical process of death itself? That is not really the main focus of this lecture. As I mentioned to you, I wanted to speak more about life itself, but just as a detail, all right? What do various traditions say when faced with the famous question, where do we go? Who would dare to answer? Where do we go? According to various traditions, for example, the Eastern traditions and the Egyptian tradition, where do we go when we die? Nowhere. Because death is neither a promotion, nor a punishment, nor a ticket for a tour. In other words, nowhere. It is said that, in fact, when a person loses their densest vehicles, the physical body, consciousness takes refuge in that small remnant of mind that remains. Now, it is interesting for you to notice that, according to these traditions, our body is part of the Earth's physical body. Our energies are part of the Earth's energy, and our mind is also part of the Earth's mind. So, when we go through this process that we know as death, each thing returns to the environment from which it came. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. Isn't that so? Thus, the physical matter returns to the physical plane, the energy returns to the energy of the earth, and our mind goes to rest at some point in the mental plane of the earth, which, according to all these traditions, the earth also possesses, right? Now, notice how interesting this is, because it is said that this mental plane, and it's not something very difficult for you to perceive, has degrees, it has levels, it has a septenary of possibilities. Do you notice that not all of your thoughts are on the same level? That's obvious, isn't it? There is a lower level of thoughts, those more connected to the physical plane, survival, instincts of procreation, sensuality. There is that intermediate level of thought, which is more focused on our emotional desires, our anxieties, our needs. And there is a higher level of thought, up above, which is oriented toward compassion, toward fraternity, toward beauty, toward unity, toward the mysteries. So, throughout your life, where has your mind been? On which of these three planes? Obviously, your mind has wandered through all three, but you notice that there is a predominant tone in the mind, which is that place where the mind feels most familiar, where it tends to be most often, where it feels at home. Once the denser vehicles are lost, where does it go? Where it has identity, where it feels at home. To those denser layers of the mind that the Eastern tradition calls Kamaloka, the realm of desires, or to that subtler place of the mind that the Eastern tradition calls Devachan, or perhaps to an intermediate region, right? So, it doesn't go anywhere. It remains where it has always been, which is the place where it built its affinity. Thus, it is said that a person prepares their afterlife where? In life. You are building your afterlife right now through the affinities you cultivate. Where does your consciousness spend most of its time during your life? That is where it will remain. Death is not a promotion. No one becomes spiritual simply because they have died. It will stay where it has always been, where you have managed to place it. Do you understand this? It seems quite logical to me. I am not here to proselytize, nor to claim that the Eastern traditions are necessarily correct. You must agree that this is quite a sensible hypothesis, isn't it? Well, it is said that at this point, when a person still has the need for experiences, when they still need to return to Earth, they spend some time experiencing this subtle plane and then intend to return to Earth and once again receive a body. This is the theory of reincarnation, which so many Eastern traditions speak about. Egypt had a very beautiful, very poetic way of seeing this, which was the ritual of weighing the heart of the deceased, a scene you may have seen depicted somewhere. Mot, who was the goddess of justice, resided in an intermediate region between heaven and earth, called the Duat, and she would wait for Anubis, the jackal-headed god, to bring the soul of the deceased with a set of scales with two pans. Upon arrival, she would take the heart of the deceased and place it on one side of the scale, and on the other side, she would place the feather that she wore on her head. If the heart of the deceased weighed less than the feather, the soul would ascend to a menti. If it weighed more than the feather, the soul would descend once again to the material world. This was the Egyptian view of reincarnation in a very simplified way, right? Now, can you imagine what could be inside the heart for it to weigh less than a feather? Material things, that car he was almost buying, that apartment he had his eye on, luck, these things are heavy. And if he desires these things, he will move in the direction where he can fulfill those desires. The idea behind Plato's allegory of the cave is the same. The cave represents the material world, and man is imprisoned there by his desires. The shadows are nothing more than that, the projection of his desires. Now, if a person has a heart that weighs less than the feather of Mot, what could be inside it? Does justice weigh anything? Does compassion weigh anything? Does honesty weigh anything? Ethics? None of these things have weight. So, the person goes to a dimension they call a menti, which is the land of Ammon, where these virtues reign. And it is not a matter of reward or punishment, no, it is a matter of justice. It would be terribly unjust to send someone who is eager for material things to a menti. That would be torture. There is nothing there that he loves. It would be terrible. So he goes in the direction his heart points, you see? The Aztec tradition, they have a god who is also the same idea spread across the four corners of the planet. Huitzilopochtli. The name is complicated, but the story is well known. Huitzilopochtli was the hummingbird god. He said that there are some men of pure heart who are hummingbird men who have hummingbird souls, and when they lose their bodies, they fly toward the sun. And there are others whose wings are not so powerful, who remain hovering around the earth and who will have to return until they become hummingbird souls. It is very beautiful because they say that the rays of the sun are the feathers of the hummingbirds who entered the sun, who went to it and entered the sun. All the hummingbird men who rose up to the sun and entered it left their feathers around it, which would be the solar radiation. It is a very beautiful tradition, very interesting. So you see that this is present in all directions. This idea is very recurrent, isn't it? So, as it is said, the ideal for a human being would be to be a hummingbird. No longer needing, no longer being bound by those chains of desire that keep one tied to the earth. It is what the Eastern traditions call samsara. This eternal return, life and death, life and death, life and death. The great aspiration for the Eastern peoples was liberation from samsara. To break this cycle and go toward the sun, to become, as the Aztecs would say, a hummingbird. Many traditions say that a person will go through the human experience many times, always learning a little more, always learning a little more. This would form a spiral until the moment when one masters all the virtues that are inherent to human nature. And then one could ask oneself, where is the center of all this? The center of the circumference, which is not found at any point on it, is at the center. The origin of the circumference is not at any point on it, but at the center. When a person questions the origin of the circumference, they go to the center and thus transcend samsara, overcoming the prison of manifestations, which is not very different from what the celts represented. However, they represented it in a slightly different way. Do you know what they used to say? That a person keeps turning like this, going through all experiences, always learning a little more. And the more one turns, the closer one gets to this center, because wisdom is about drawing near to the center, which is the human ideal, the state of full humanity. And as one draws closer, closer, and closer, a cone begins to form. When he reached the top, having mastered himself and attained the center, this was crowned by a 5-pointed star, which represents humanity's mastery over material factors. Does this cone with a 5-pointed star on top remind you of anything? Have you ever seen something similar? Didn't you use something like this in your home this past December? No, that was more or less the idea, wasn't it? So, this concept of samsara, this notion of humanity's imprisonment within the material world, and the understanding that striving to become what truly belongs to us is what allows us to find our center. And that we are bound to this by an illusion, by not knowing who we truly are. There is a very beautiful story, yet another story for you to remember. You know, some of you are familiar with this. We have within our school an Institute of Philosophical Martial Arts, which is the Bodhidharma Institute. And this Bodhidharma was a great sage who is said to have been one of the introducers of martial arts in the ancient Shaolin school, in the old Shaolin temple. And there is a story that the first successor, the first patriarch who succeeded Bodhidharma in the tradition, was a young man named Huichua. Some of you may know this story. It is a very beautiful story, and it is said that Huichua spent years at the gates of this monastery, waiting for Bodhidharma to give him an opportunity to be accepted as a disciple. And Bodhidharma was always very reticent about accepting his disciples. Evidently, he could not pass on his wisdom to just anyone. He was very responsible with regard to knowledge, as all true masters have always been. And it is said that Huichua persisted, and persisted, until, at a certain moment, in the midst of a snowstorm, Bodhidharma takes pity on that man standing in the freezing cold and decides to go over and ask him what he wanted from him. Master, will you at least allow me one question? Will you at least grant me one request? And Bodhidharma says, all right. One request. Then, it is said that Huichua turns to him and says, Master, will you free me from samsara? And Bodhidharma replies to him, who put you in it? And simply with that question, Huichua attained enlightenment. He realized that he was in samsara because he identified with it, and nothing more, and that it was a matter of a mental polarity, a key. I am not that. I am a human being, and human beings are not prisoners of samsara. They are not prisoners of a chain, of chasing after instincts, chasing after the instinct to procreate, the instinct to survive, that is animal, that is not human. Right? I chose to be there, and I can reverse that key, choose to be human. Once again, Immanuel Kant said that if one day there is a God who judges us, he will judge us not as conditioned beings, but as free beings who even chose to let themselves be conditioned. They chose to give up the human condition. So all these elements, all these reflections, were made by people who knew how to live and knew how to die, considering everything as a natural continuity of life. Socrates once was asked, Socrates, where do the living come from? And he replied, well, my dear, what a question. Where do the dead come from? What nonsense, Socrates. The dead come from the living. And he said, what nonsense, my dear. The living come from the dead. The eternal return of life. A continuous process of self-improvement, a constant endeavor to build oneself, to master, through merit, that which nature has given us as potential, to be human, which is an honor. Living in this way ensures serenity and tranquility in the face of death, or however many deaths may come. Well, returning to the subject of that magazine I mentioned to you, the materialistic view of eternity. The idea proposed in the article, which, let's be honest, is really just an article to sell magazines, right? Because to claim that we will achieve the idea, eternity in a physical body, not even a galaxy will attain eternity in a physical form, because everything has an end, everything concludes at a certain point. This is obvious. The only thing permanent and perpetual in the material world is change, is constant transformation. Can there be greater longevity? Yes, there can, but this brings a series of considerations that we would need to address. Imagine the millions invested to extend a person's life to 200 years, while in most African countries, life expectancy is around 25 to 30 years old. We face social, political, moral, and all kinds of problems that could wipe out humanity at any moment. So, all these issues, a huge number of complex medications to grant greater longevity to one or two people who can afford it, especially in such a critical moment. At the very least, this already seems somewhat disconnected from reality. My entire family lives in Rio de Janeiro, and yesterday they called me and told me something that really surprised me because, well, I was born and raised in the city and I have never seen anything like it. They said it reached 48 degrees in Rio de Janeiro. In the last 100 years, there has never been such a temperature. The entire planet is reacting in an aggressive way, and we don't know what lies ahead. And are people pretending not to see it? And there are million-dollar investments to make humans live to 200 years old? Well, it seems like a questionable joke, doesn't it? Now consider, since we are working on the mental plane, what if this were achieved? Remember Todal's bar. There comes a moment when you have created so many ties, so much bitterness, so many knots, that you are no longer able to grow, yet your body goes on. And your body continues while you remain stagnant internally. As a human being, you no longer advance even a single step, but your body keeps going. Is that a life worthy of being lived? Or wouldn't it be more appropriate to let nature, which, as it seems, is wiser than we are, decide at what point our experience no longer has meaning, since we do not even fully understand the essence of our experience, or what we have come here to do? Imagine what it would be like to prolong a life for 200 years without any meaning, filled only with bitterness, only with criticism, only with negative mental patterns, only causing harm to the lives of those around us. As Cicero, another remarkable thinker, used to say, make sure that you are a positive influence in the lives of those with whom you share your journey. If we cannot even ensure that, then we are disregarding the aspect of quality of life in favor of mere quantity of life. A society that thinks only about how much, and not about how, ends up reaching certain things that are somewhat questionable, strange, and of very debatable value. At this moment, is this truly a priority? Another great philosopher, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, used to say, a good action is one that meets a need in the world or within ourselves. Is this a need of the world, or our own, at this moment? Or should we take these 60 or 70 years that we have and learn to live them with dignity, because we do not even do that? In 60 or 70 years, our lives are overflowing because we do not know how to use them properly. Why do we want more life? More quantity? Wouldn't it be better to have more quality? Speaking from a human perspective, not just physical quality. So, there are a number of reflections that would be interesting to consider. That same magazine, which addressed this subject so technically, managed to shock me. I thought it wouldn't be able to do that, but it did. A few pages after the article about immortality, they advertised a video game for young people. The video game consisted of pretending you are a refugee from Sudan, fleeing extermination troops and trying to find food. And as you succeeded, you earned points. Well, this is happening. 300,000 people have already died. Isn't it a bit morbid to have young people play with this? What kind of values does this society hold? Imagine a person with these values living for 200 years. What does goodness mean under these conditions? What level of values is society cultivating to always want more, more, and more? In other words, it is a level of morbidity that borders on madness. So, when we focus too much on the quantitative and disregard the human aspect of life, we fall into these bizarre situations that sometimes seem like an outbreak of collective madness. Well, these are some reflections I wanted to share with you. As I mentioned, the focus of our talk today is to briefly touch on a few elements, not about death itself, because if we were to discuss death, we could spend the entire night here talking about it. What did the Egyptians think? What did the Tibetans think? In fact, we have an excellent lecture recorded on DVD dedicated solely to the Bardo Thodol for those who are interested. For anyone who is curious, we have several lectures. All of our talks are filmed on DVD, which is also a way for us to share our work. The Bardo Thodol is a truly fascinating book. But all of these topics are covered in our course of philosophy in the classical tradition. The reflections we bring to our lectures are an excerpt of what we do within the philosophy course. Today, philosophy has fallen into disrepute, seeming to be something merely intellectual and of very little practical use. Socrates, whom we can justly consider one of the patriarchs of philosophy, one of the great philosophers of the past, used to say with all his authority, "Only the knowledge that makes us better is useful." That is to say, philosophy is the art of living. And the art of dying as well. Why not? To know how to do both with dignity as a human being. Therefore, all these subjects, from the Tibetan, Egyptian, and Indian traditions, are addressed within our philosophy course. To better understand what it means to be human, what the human condition is, and to be worthy heirs of the legacy that nature has bestowed upon us. To live not just in any way, not merely to survive, but to truly live. For however long we have, because time is not only about duration, it also has verticality and depth. And in this dimension of depth, of verticality, we can indeed unfold our lives many times over, without the need for so many complicated and unfamiliar medications.